What's happening at NZME, the country's largest publicly listed media company? What has happened is a group of shareholders, kind of sparked by the actions of one man, Jim Grennan, who's a New Zealand resident, lives up in Takapuna. I'm going to call him Takapuna man Jim Grennan. All the rest of the media call him Canadian-born billionaire, like that's a bad thing. Takapuna billionaire Jim Grennan says he wants to clean out the board, and he's got together with enough shareholders to win a vote to kick out every member of NZME's board and replace them with people he says will run the company more commercially and run the company better as a media organisation. Now, in business, if you are a shareholder and you got enough votes, and they don't need 50%, I'll explain to you why this group doesn't need 50%. To vote on the issue of directorships, you need to hold a certain type of share with a certain level of transparency about it. And I'm not sure of the details of this, but essentially, if you like, non-active institutional shareholders don't have the same voting rights as others. So Jim Grennan, along with others, and actually the biggest shareholder in NZME is a guy or a head of a conglomerate or a group in Australia. They own about 19%, I think. So Jim Grennan writes this letter to the board. He says, here's why I think you've been doing an absolutely crap job. And we want you to all resign. And at the AGM on, I think, April the 29th, you've all got to step down and we'll appoint new directors. And they'll make some changes at NZME. Well, you would think if you're a director appointed by your shareholders, who are your bosses, and your shareholders say you're gone, you'd do the decent thing, wouldn't you? You'd resign. Or you'd accept the fact that you're no longer wanted in the role. Now, these people get paid, and don't forget, this isn't their only gig. They get paid probably 150, 200 grand a year for being directors of the Herald, maybe more. The chief executive's on 3 million, which is quite a lot of lolly, 6 times more than the Prime Minister. Okay, so really that's what it is. This is just numbers and shares. But it would appear to me that the board members, and I think there are 4 or 5 of them, they're revolting against the shareholders who are telling them they're gone. And a group of them, I understand as many as 3, though not including the board chairman, Barbara Chapman, flew to Sydney last week to meet with this person who holds 19% of the shares and is on board with Jim Grennan and the get rid of the board plan, the board members, board of directors plan. Before they came, he said to these 3 people, don't come, I've already made up my mind. I'm voting for the Grennan proposal and I'm not going to change my mind. And he went, but these 3 people went to see this guy and he said, going to be a short meeting, guys. Oh, look, we think it's wrong. We think you should keep us on. We've been really good. And he said, I've never heard from you guys, and all the time I've owned shares in NZME, this is the first time you've ever contacted me as a shareholder, as your single biggest shareholder. So they got given very short shrift, but they were basically going to this guy to beg to keep their jobs. I wonder who paid for them to fly to Sydney. No doubt business class. No doubt they stayed at a nice hotel and had a bang-up meal. So those directors came back to Auckland with their tails between their legs, having been told, no, I'm with Grennan, and Grennan's definitely got the numbers. There's just no question about this. Now, also, we've got the union trying to run interference on this. And Michael Wood, former Labour Cabinet Minister, laughingly making all claims about editorial impartiality, which he wouldn't know if it jumped up and bit him on the arse. The other thing I'll point out about Etu Union getting so into this issue at the Herald is that they represent not only not all the journalists who work there, so they do not have 100% coverage. Journalists do not represent by in any margin the majority of people who work at NZME. There are people who do technical stuff, people like Josh sitting here. There are salespeople. There are accounts people. E2 Union do not have universal coverage in NZME. And quite clearly what we're seeing from Michael Wood is biased, is a political campaign against the lefty journalists of the Herald newsroom losing control, losing propaganda control of one of the bigger news organisations and one of the biggest newspaper in the country. So that's what we're seeing there. So we can take E2 Union, we can throw that out. Jim Grennan doesn't see why he's got to have anything to do with E2 Union. He's the owner. He's not the chairman of the board. He's not on the board of the directors. Jim's the owner. He might well be chairman of the board and he might be on the board. But that's an industrial relations matter. What E2 Union are not involved. They don't have a brief to protect journalism or democracy in this country. Like any good union, they should just be worried about negotiating good pay and conditions for their members. That's all their job is. But of course, we all know in New Zealand that's not the job of unions. The job of unions is to manipulate their members, use their members to fund them, and then they can fund the Labour Party. That's how unions work in New Zealand, and we all know it, and it's a crock. So as I say, these 3 board members went over Sydney last week. They begged for their jobs and got told to rack off. They've come back, and we understand now, I understand that the board is writing to individual shareholders trying to get enough votes to stop Grennan. They haven't figured out yet, because of the way this has been done, that boat has long since sailed. So what we are watching now is the unsightly and unseemly view of a bunch of directors who have let a company go, let a news organisation lose its credibility and trust with the public on their watch, and they are now desperately scrambling to save their own bottoms. They're trying to shore up the hole. They're rats trying to shore up the hole in a sinking ship, aren't they? And I do not, and I cannot see how they will be successful. Meantime, in the newsroom at the Herald, it seems to me Shane Carey's attitude to all this has changed. Maybe he sees the writing on the wall and that a new regime is coming. Maybe Shane Carey doesn't think Jim Grennon's such a bad guy after all. And maybe if you were interested in keeping your job as a journalist or a columnist, particularly on the Herald, you might start writing stories that are a little more or less aggressive towards capitalism, free markets, and business. Maybe that'd be the way to go. I just think that was a very fascinating development. I do not know how as a board of directors you can actually use the company's money to campaign against your shareholders.